I'm very delighted to welcome you to our Hawke's Oration and to see all of these fabulous people in the room this morning. And I know we've got people from all tiers of government. And of course, I'll introduce Peter Mears in a moment. I first of all, though, want to acknowledge that no matter where we are in Australia, we're on the lands of First Nations people. Here in Darwin, we're on the lands of Larrakia people, beautiful lands, beautiful waters, been looked after for tens of thousands of years through stewardship and care. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for the care and the culture that they're passing on through the generations. And I also acknowledge that the Larrakia people have never ceded sovereignty of this land. So this morning is our David Hawke's Oration, named after David Hawke's PSM, who was one of the very long-serving Commissioners for Public Employment here in the Northern Territory. David was a moderniser, and part of what IPAA has done here in the Northern Territory is make sure that we've got an oration around public sector matters. Now, I know that some of you are not members of IPAA, and I have cunningly put on the tables this morning a little flyer encouraging you to join us. We like to run events. We are, of course, a place where we can have public service adjacent dialogues and conversations and debates without being too worried by the strictures that might otherwise come of being a public servant. Of course, if you're Northern Territory Public Service, code of conduct. It's a joke. But thank you very much, everyone, for turning up today. It is really delighted. We did originally set the table numbers at 50, and we got the call from our colleagues in IPAA WA who are helping us now with administration to say you need to increase the numbers. So we went to 80, and we thought, well, we're never going to get to that number. And then they rang back about half a day later and said, go to the maximum that the Hilton venue can accommodate. And so we have done that. It is amazing that you've all turned up. I think it is no doubt, though, due to our fabulous orator this morning, Peter Mears. Peter is an independent writer and researcher. He's a contributing editor at Inside Story magazine. And of course, for some of you who know and love Cranlana, and I know there's a few of you in the room this morning, a member of the moderating team at the Cranlana Centre for Ethical Leadership, an adjunct senior research fellow at Monash University School of Media, Film and Journalism, and a fellow with the Centre for Policy Development. We were lucky to get Peter, who's just come off doing a 5 or 6 day program called Delivering in Partnership between the Northern Territory Public Service, the Australian Public Service, and working with Aboriginal communities. And so we were very lucky to persuade Peter, not that he needed much persuading, to come and be our orator this morning. So we are delighted about that. Peter, of course, is the author of 3 books, No Place Like Home, Repairing Australia's Housing Crisis, Not Quite Australian, How Temporary Migration is Changing the Nation, and Borderline, which is an award-winning analysis of Australia's approach to refugees and asylum seekers. Peter has spent 25 years as a broadcaster with the ABC, presenting national radio programs and working as a foreign correspondent based in Southeast Asia. So Peter will be talking to us on a topic that he has worked through, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. But would you please join me in welcoming Peter as our David Hawke.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you for inviting me. Let me also start by acknowledging the elders of the Larrakia Nation and extending my respect to them and extending that respect to any Aboriginal leaders with us in the room today. Let me also start by saying how honoured I am to speak in the David Hawke's Oration when I see the roll call of previous distinguished speakers, the likes of Professor Nick Dodson, Claire Martin, Fred Cheney, Annabelle Crabb, just to name a few. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be listed in such august company. I hope my presentation does justice to the occasion and honours David Hawke's contribution to public administration and good governance over many decades. The topic that Vicky asked me to address was modern ethical dilemmas for public servants, and it was me who added the subtitle, From Yes Minister to Utopia. In doing so, I flagged my view that the most pressing modern ethical dilemmas that public servants face are long-standing and arise from a challenge that is unlikely ever to be resolved, as it shifts shape and to throw up new quandaries. And that challenge is finding the appropriate relationship between public servants and ministers, or to be more encompassing, between public servants and ministers' offices, given the plethora of contemporary political advisors who claim to speak for ministers or to act on ministerial authority. The relationship between public servant and ministerial office must find the right mix of responsiveness and robustness. It must chart a course between accountability to the duly elected executive government on the one hand, and independence from ministers' personal ambitions, desires and whims on the other, so that partnership doesn't morph into politicisation. Now that alliterative pairing, partnership and politicisation, is taken from the title of an article published in the Australian Journal of Public Administration in 1999, written by David Hawkes, who was at that time Commissioner for Public Employment in the Northern Territory. And in his article, David expressed the view that the relationships between ministers and top public sector executives in the Northern Territory had evolved to become stable and mature rather than cosy. Now, I can't speak to the accuracy of David's assessment of the state of affairs in the Territory at the time, or to how that relationship has evolved since he wrote that article, though no doubt you'll have your views and we can discuss them during the question time perhaps. But the report of the Royal Commission into Robodebt is the latest and most spectacular reminder that this relationship needs constant vigilance, because when it goes wrong, the damage can be profound, undermining faith in government, belief in democratic processes and trust in the rule of law. And as we've seen with Robodebt, failures can destroy reputations and careers, and in the most tragic cases, even take lives. The relationship between ministers and public servants is, I'm sure, one that you think about deeply and are probably confronted with daily, just as David Hawkes was grappling with it as he led the development of a new Public Sector Employment and Management Act for the Northern Territory in the early 1990s. I, by contrast, have never worked as a public sector leader. The closest I ever came was as a mid-level editorial manager in the ABC, a large publicly funded bureaucracy, but not really a public service. And even that experience lies 30 years in the past. So I approach this topic with deference to the collective knowledge and experience gathered in this room. I note, though, that in the course of my work, I spend quite a bit of time engaging with public servants, both as a writer on public policy issues and as a moderator with Cranlana Centre for Ethical Leadership. And it's possible that public servants reveal private concerns and uncertainties to me that they may be reluctant to pass up the chain to senior executives. So I hope my observations, as an outsider, can stimulate further discussion on this enduring topic. Now, I take Yes Minister and Utopia as my starting point because I think these two comedic fictions represent two poles in the debate about the proper relationship between public servants and ministers, and show how the pendulum can swing from one to the other. In the 1980s BBC satire, Yes Minister, government initiatives are constantly stymied by an obstructive civil service, embodied in the personage of Permanent Secretary Sir Humphrey Appleby. On the surface, Sir Humphrey is deferential to his minister, Jim Hacker, but he manages to subvert the minister's initiatives at every turn, demonstrating where the real power lies. The phrase, Yes Minister, implies its opposite, as a hidebound bureaucracy protects the status quo. Fast forward 40 years or so to the ABC comedy Utopia, and the tables are turned. Tony Woodford, CEO of the Nation Building Authority, and his sensible deputy, Nat Russell, doggedly attempt to pursue evidence-based infrastructure projects only to run into brick walls put up by a minister's office which is far more focused on electoral consequences than public benefit. The incompetence of the rest of Tony and Nat's team provides some slapstick laughs at the expense of the public service, and I don't find that bit quite so funny because that's not my experience of the public service. But the core of the satire and why I enjoy the show lies in Tony's attempts to stand against the tide of political pressure that nevertheless usually overwhelms him. If, however, Tony were to preemptively buckle rather than be outflanked by the politics, there would be nothing to laugh at. As spin repeatedly defeats substance in utopia, the line between comedy and tragedy is thin. Now, ministers understandably want public servants to realise their policies. 4 years ago, a few months after voters returned the coalition to office in 2019, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison laid out his expectations of the public service in a speech delivered at Parliament House at an event hosted by IPAA. And Morrison said that once ministers had set the policy direction, the public service should get on and deliver it. It's about telling governments how things can be done, he said, not just the risks of doing them or saying why they shouldn't. The public service is meant to be an enabler of government policy, not an obstacle. In his 1999 article, David Hawkes writes that the Territory's first Chief Minister, Paul Everingham, had a similar view, summed up in the exhortation often delivered to senior public servants, "Don't tell me why it can't be done, just do it." As Robodebt shows, elected governments can be their own worst enemies and should be careful what they wish for. They are better served by public servants who stand up to them and who do tell them why it can't be done, rather than acquiescing or smoothing the way. Sometimes it is good to be an obstacle. Sometimes the right response is no minister. I won't go into the detail of Robodebt. I'm sure you've all read the overview of the scheme from Commissioner Catherine Holmes, her chapter on improving the Australian public service, and her closing remarks. And if you haven't, then I commend them to you. I'll pick out a few choice quotes. Truly dismaying, the Commissioner writes in her overview, was the revelation of dishonesty and collusion to prevent the scheme's lack of legal foundation coming to light. Equally disheartening was the ineffectiveness of institutional checks and balances in presenting any hindrance to the scheme's continuation. Here she mentions the Commonwealth Ombudsman, the Information Commissioner, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and several other bodies. She might also have noted that as early as June 2017, when Robodebt was still a new term and written with a hyphen, the Senate Community Affairs Committee made adverse findings about automated income averaging and condemned the scheme's lack of procedural fairness, but failed to identify its illegality or bring it to a halt. Robodebt, the Commissioner writes, was a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal. It was a costly failure of public administration in both human and economic terms. In her concluding remark, she says her inquiry has brought into the open an extraordinary saga, illustrating a myriad of ways that things can go wrong through venality, incompetence, and cowardice. Strong words. In considering the lessons from Robodebt, we should be wary of regarding it as a one-off, an exception to the rule of a reliable public service that is, in general, not venal but moral, not incompetent but competent, not cowardly but brave. Such an approach would seek to lay blame at the feet of individual players who've let down the side. Don't get me wrong, there are individuals who should be held to account for their acts and omissions, and we wait to see what flows from the referrals in the sealed section of the Commissioner's report. But it's a mistake to assume that the fault lies only with a few bad apples, or with the tone dictated from the top by a particular minister, since we know that any crop of public servants will be of variable quality, and that dictatorial ministers will come and go on both sides of politics. Sadly, there's plenty of evidence from federal and state and territory level to suggest that the type of problems identified by the Royal Commission are not isolated to one department or one jurisdiction and are more systemic in nature. Let me cite a couple of other examples to make my point. At the Commonwealth level, there's the Auditor General's inquiry into the $2 billion Community Health and Hospitals program. The auditor concluded that the administration of the program was, quote, ineffective and fell short of ethical requirements. There was, quote, deliberate breaches of the Commonwealth grants, rules and guidelines, and a failure to advise government where there was no legislative authority for grant expenditure. The Department of Health and Aged Care had set up an expression of interest process to assess project proposals against established criteria, but more than half the funded projects bypassed this mechanism and lacked a supporting proposal. The department provided no advice to the minister on their merits or weaknesses. In fact, only 2 of the 63 approved projects were determined by the department to be highly suitable, even though this was supposed to be the threshold for shortlisting and further consideration. In reality, the department was playing catch-up, monitoring the media to keep track of ministerial funding announcements, as much of the spending was committed to projects in battleground seats in 3 months from February to April 2019. In other words, just before a tightly fought federal election. As David Crowe put it in the Sydney Morning Herald, the political promise came first and the paperwork came second, as the Morrison bus pork-barreled its way to the polls. It's no surprise that politicians will seek to spend money to get re-elected, with scant regard for public good. But as Crowe asks, where were the roadblocks? The public service not only rolled over, but as with Robodebt, it smoothed the way. It acted without lawful authority, and the Auditor General found that in at least some cases, this involved deliberate breaches by senior management of the relevant legal requirements and the principles underpinning them. Lest you think I'm being partisan here, let's turn to an example from my home state, Victoria, where Labor has been in office for all but four of the past 24 years, and where there is considerable disquiet in public service ranks about the centralisation of power in the Premier's private office. In April, IPAA, that's Victoria's Anti-Corruption Commission, found that improper influence had compromised the procurement process for a $1.2 million training contract. This contract was awarded without an open tender to the newly formed Health Education Federation, which had no relevant experience, no sound governance arrangements, and was not even a registered training organisation. The directors, however, held executive positions at the Health Workers Union, which is affiliated to the Labor Party, a clear but undeclared conflict of interest. Staff in the then Department of Health and Human Services had significant concerns about the proposal and pushed for an open tender. Senior executives could have insisted either on a competitive process or, if it was not to be competitive, asked the minister to issue a formal instruction on the preferred procurement mechanism. An advisor from the minister's office gave them to understand that this would make the minister unhappy. A deputy secretary caved in, and the union-linked Health Education Foundation was the only organisation invited to bid for the training work. While their detailed proposal was being assessed by the department, the Premier's private office was busy drafting an election commitment to train 1,000 health workers in partnership with the union, confident the union's Health Education Foundation would get the gig, as indeed it did. With the contract awarded on the 30th of October 2018, just hours before the public service went into caretaker mode ahead of the November state election. The saga continued after the election. Labor was re-elected, when the department raised serious concerns about the quality of the training that was being provided. Again, the Premier's private office intervened. This is all from the IPAA report. And the department was dissuaded from taking steps to terminate the contract. 2 years ago, when Justice Bernard Murphy of the Federal Court approved a $1.8 billion settlement in the Robodebt case, he described it as a shameful chapter in public administration. When considering how this flawed and unlawful scheme was allowed to continue for so long, he said he was reminded of the aphorism that given a choice between a stuff-up, even a massive one, and a conspiracy, one should usually choose a stuff-up. With due respect to a learned judge, I think this is the wrong way to think about the problem. It's not necessarily a choice between conspiracy and stuff-up. It may be a question of whether the relationship between public servants and ministers' offices are stable and mature, or cosy, to use David Hawke's language. It's productive to ponder, as the Robodebt Royal Commissioner does, the remarkable lengths public servants were prepared to go to oblige ministers on a quest for savings. We might say the same about the remarkable lengths public servants were prepared to go to oblige ministers on a quest for spending in marginal electorates before an election as part of the Community Grants Program. Or the remarkable lengths public servants were prepared to go to oblige ministers on a quest to award a training contract before an election to a union-linked education provider that was ill-suited for the job. In each case, we could identify key figures, often senior figures, who failed to show sufficient moral fortitude and who might have acted differently. But such finger-pointing lacks explanatory power. This was not corruption in the common sense understanding of the word. It wasn't an exchange of goods or favours in return for illegal dealing. And it's highly unlikely that these senior executives didn't understand their role or purpose, or that they failed to absorb the public service values and codes of conduct that were supposed to guide their actions. It seems more likely that they were motivated by a desire to please the minister's office, or at least a desire not to make the minister unhappy, and that this consideration swayed their judgment. I'm not suggesting that senior public servants necessarily think explicitly, oh dear, my job's on the line here, oh, I might not get a promotion, if the minister's displeased. Such motivations can be insidious and all the more powerful because the individual involved is not fully aware of them. And so the threat to their integrity and professionalism is not front of mind. This is what's sometimes called an ethical blind spot, which scholars Basserman and Tenbrunzel define as a temporary inability to see the ethical dimension of a decision, which leads people to deviate from their own values and principles. This deviation is unintentional and may even be unconscious. Let me explain by way of analogy. You're probably familiar with the monkey business illusion. It's a selective attention test where you watch a video of 6 people throwing basketballs, 3 are in white t-shirts, 3 are in black t-shirts, and your task is to count the number of times the players in the white t-shirts pass the ball. Now, most people get the correct answer, but they fail to notice the figure in the gorilla suit who walks through the middle of the court between the whizzing balls, stands there, thumps their chest, King Kong style, and then walks off again. Because our attention is focused on counting the passes, we fail to see the gorilla. And in my view, this helps explain what went wrong in the cases of Robodebt, the Community Health Grants Program, and the Health Education Fund. Public servants, senior, experienced public servants, were so focused on meeting the objective at hand that other considerations like lawfulness or proper process disappeared from view. The concept of a moral compass is useful here. We might like to think that when there's a scandal, at the heart of it is a public servant who lacked a moral compass. But while there are a few psychopaths out there, such cases are rare. Most people want to be seen and to see themselves as decent, ethical people, and they strive to do the right thing. But you know what happens when you put a magnet next to a compass, right? The needle swings away from true north. And the same thing is true of our moral compass. It can be pulled off course by powerful, attractive forces assembled around us. And this may not be venal in the sense of being knowingly weak and dishonest or corrupt. Let me offer the example of conflicted remuneration from another Royal Commission, this one into financial services. It found that financial advisors routinely recommended products that earned then, the advisors, the highest returns in the forms of commissions and bonuses, regardless of whether these products were the most appropriate ones for their clients. Now, it's not because financial advisors were unaware of their professional duty to act in the best interests of their client, or because they needed more training or lacked a moral compass. The problem is that the system of reward created a perverse incentive. It acted like a magnet that threw their ethical judgment out of whack. A friend recounted an even more mundane example showing that even social embarrassment can hinder us from doing what is right. This friend is a former senior public sector executive, decades of experience. He's also a CPA, and he recently, in his retirement, joined the, or semi-retirement I guess, joined the Audit and Risk Committee of a major government department. At his second meeting, he noticed a discrepancy in the minutes. And he wondered, should I say anything? After all, the minutes have been prepared by the Secretariat, they've been cleared by the Chair, and none of the other more experienced directors have raised any concerns. My friend nearly let the matter go. As a newbie, he wanted to fit in. He didn't want to come across as a nitpicker. And he had to overcome significant hesitation to raise the matter. When he did, the Chair and the other directors were grateful to him. But as my friend said to me, how close I came to censoring my own behaviour on a really trivial matter, out of embarrassment, essentially. Evidence from behavioural psychology shows that we are profoundly influenced by the desire to fit in, by systems of reward and incentive, by the approval of authority figures, and by the behaviour of those around us. Regardless of how carefully crafted our value statement may be, or how well schooled our staff are in understanding that statement and those values, they can be quickly overwhelmed by the way things are done around here. Culture is more powerful than codes of conduct, and bad apples are often the product of bad barrels. If pleasing the minister's office wins favour and advances careers, that sends a very clear message, and it will become the culture of the workplace. It will be the exceptions, not the rule, who refuse to accommodate themselves to it. Those who stand their ground, those who ask difficult questions, those who speak up, are likely to be seen as troublesome and as not team players. They'll find themselves on the outer and become demoralised or cynical or both. The philosopher Immanuel Kant observed that out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. We need to recognise that human beings are flawed. We are prone to fall victim to ethical blind spots. That's not a moral failing, it's a fact of our evolutionary psychology, if you like. As profoundly social beings, we want to fit in with the group. Because we seek approval from authority figures, because we're built to focus on the task at hand and filter out other matters. And so the pressure to achieve a revenue target or deliver an outcome occupies our attention and blends out the gorilla, questions about probity, integrity and process. It's important to remember that the government, the ministers, Cabinet didn't invent robo-debt. The government's policy aim was to claw back overpayments. It was public servants who came up with robo-debt as the mechanism to achieve this end. Other options were open to them, including advising government robustly that the billions of dollars it had promised to recover were illusory. ANU Social Security expert Peter Whiteford asked, were the public servants involved simply saying things simply because they thought that's what the minister wanted to hear? Independent federal MP Rebecca Sharkey said in response to robo-debt, we've moved away from the public service being a service to the public to being a service to the ministers. Responsiveness had overwhelmed robustness and partnerships had become politicised. And I don't mean necessarily that senior public servants had identified themselves with the fortunes of the party holding office or with the ideology of that party, though it seems some did buy into the populist demonisation of the unemployed as leaners, not lifters. More importantly, though, they lost sight of the distinction between the political aims of government and their role as servants of the public. No public servant sets out to find themselves being grilled by a parliamentary committee, giving evidence to an anti-corruption agency or fronting a royal commission, let alone being referred for further sanctions in its sealed section. Those painful interactions arise because other less painful but still very difficult conversations were avoided earlier on, because of a desire not to make the minister unhappy or because relations were cosy rather than mature and stable. China, with its merits-based appointments process, influenced the shape of the British civil service, which in turn helped to shape the Australian system. And that is, of course, where we get the term Mandarin, which some people might apply to you, Mandarins in this room. And Chinese folklore is replete with stories of decent, wise officials who are killed or exiled for their well-founded criticisms of harsh and corrupt rulers. It's more honourable to be a critic than a sycophant. In Australia, the stakes aren't quite so high.
No public servant is going to be executed or imprisoned or deported for pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, that policy is not based on evidence or lacks a legal basis, or that due process has been ignored or procedural fairness compromised. There are various protections for speaking out, including the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that I've heard public servants discussing how they're schooled in finding ways to avoid direct answers to straightforward questions. I've heard how sticky notes and corridor conversations are used to avoid establishing a paper trail that might be discoverable through a freedom of information request, even when that system is so woefully cumbersome, opaque, inadequate and slow that the last commissioner threw in the towel after just 1 year. Freedom of information surely warrants its own episode of Utopia. As a writer on public policy, my favourite recommendation from the Robodebt Royal Commission, and the one I think is least likely to be implemented, is that the blanket in-confidence rule applied to cabinet documents should be reviewed. And documents should only be withheld from scrutiny where that is reasonably justified on identifiable public interest grounds. New Zealand routinely publishes cabinet documents, and the long white cloud of their sky is yet to fall in. I don't want to leave you on a pessimistic note or to suggest that all is lost. As Vicky mentioned, I've just spent an intense 6 days with a group of Northern Territory and Australian public servants, and you couldn't hope to find a more impressive, intelligent, thoughtful group grappling with really tough issues, committed to proper process, and dedicated to improving the lives of citizens. And this confirms my view, based on my frequent interactions with public servants, that most are hard-working, decent folk with a clear sense of right and wrong and a dedication to advancing the public good whenever and wherever they can. No one exemplifies this more than one of the heroes emerging from the Robodebt saga, former Centrelink officer Colleen Taylor, who raised serious concerns about the scheme from its earliest days. She recognised that income averaging would result in a large number of debts being issued to people when they didn't really owe a debt, and would not produce a result that was even close to right in many cases. She was convinced that senior leadership simply didn't understand what was happening on the ground, and against the advice of her colleagues, who told her not to do it, she wrote a long explanatory email to the Secretary of the Department, copying in its media spokesman, and raising specific concerns about the accuracy and the legality of the debts being raised. This prompted a phone conference with 3 other senior executives from the department, but Colleen Taylor's concerns were dismissed. Colleen Taylor, writes the Commissioner in her concluding remarks of her report, Colleen Taylor clearly saw that the Emperor had no clothes and did her best in a dispassionate, loyal way to warn the Secretary of the Department. She was absolutely correct in the points she made, but they were highly inconvenient and they were never going to be received in the spirit in which they were delivered. My 3 other favourite recommendations from the Royal Commission are that senior executives should spend more time on the front line of service delivery alongside the likes of Colleen Taylor, and that they should draw on frontline expertise when designing and implementing new programs, and that they should establish a reference group of people who receive income support to advise on improving services. A friend of mine worked at Medicare when it had a program like that first one, the idea of spending time on the front line. He said the scheme was very popular. Every senior executive spent time in a call centre and a Medicare office, and having interacted with the front line and the frontline staff, they came back with lots of suggestions for improvement. We need cultural change, but as Paddy Gourlay writes in Inside Story, cultural change is not a rabbit that can be pulled out of a hat. It requires changes in organisational structures, laws, procedures and people. Or as one of the most perceptive commentators on Robodebt, its administrative law expert Darren O'Donovan writes, when it comes to careerism or the pursuit of power, history tells us human nature will not be changed by refreshed seminars on ethics. You need to change the underlying relationships of power and accountability. We need to create structures and processes that scaffold ethical behaviour, such as a requirement for documentation, whether ministers like it or not. We cannot rely on the moral fortitude of extraordinary individuals like Colleen Taylor. Public servants shouldn't have to be heroes. Individual integrity and a well-calibrated moral compass are essential, but they are not sufficient. Human beings are made from crooked timber, and we are all, every one of us in this room, we are all at risk of ethical failure. As I said at the outset, in my view, the most pressing modern ethical dilemma that public servants face, dilemmas that public servants face are not new, but long-standing. While senior executives should be brought to account for their acts and omissions, it would be a mistake to focus on bad apples only. Then, when the problem is more likely to be bad barrels. We need to establish systems and processes that foster stable, mature relationships between public servants and ministers, not cosy ones. Relationships that make it easier to be an obstacle and say no, minister, as and when the need arises. Thank you.
We're going to open the room up for questions, and so Bryn and Sarah are going to help and make sure that you get a microphone if you've got a question to ask. I'm going to take the role as convener and ask a question, and that is, often when we talk about the relationships between public servants and senior public servants, but public servants and ministers, we sometimes in the literature think about it as a straight line. It's public servants to ministers. But of course, ministers are very busy. And particularly here, you know, in the Northern Territory, ministers, we've got large jurisdiction, small number of ministers. Ministers are very busy, and they have to be responsive, not just in their own portfolio, but to their constituents as well. And so we have advisors, and they're often not thought about. Now, I don't want this to be an opportunity to, I'm certainly not taking the opportunity to denigrate the role of advisors, but I'm wondering about the role of advisors and the kind of work that we should do as public servants in helping them understand what the role of public servants vis-a-vis ministers are. Have you got an answer? Because I'd love to know it. Thank you.
Well, I think I don't have a direct answer, but I think that the role of advisors, you know, their role is at the heart of this as well. So I know that there's talk about reviewing the MOPS Act in the federal arena, because there's a lack of accountability, and it's, I would say, probably worse in my experience in Victoria at the state level, where advisors, political staff essentially, claim to speak for the minister or to assume they know what the minister wants. And there is a difficulty, of course, you know, ministers are too busy to have every conversation and so on. But, you know, if you come then have a parliamentary committee or whatever, the advisor can't be called to account. Public servant can, the minister can, but the advisor disappears from view. We've seen this over and over again. So I do think I don't know the answers. I'd be interested if anyone else thinks they have an idea here, but we certainly do need to review the way that their role, because that role has, you know, since Whitlam, and they partly came in out of that yes minister idea that, you know, after however many years of decades of the Menzies government, that you couldn't trust the public service. You needed to have your own people, your own advice. So I think, you know, that is a real problem, as is the problem of advice coming in sideways from outside the department via the Big Four and all the rest of it, as we've seen, the kind of outsourcing problem, which is another issue, where again the accountability questions are less clear.
We are in a contestable policy domain.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, and
contestable advice.
Yeah, and advice should be contestable. I don't have a problem with that. It's when it's. So I've heard stories about, without revealing too many confidences here, in one case where a Secretary of Department could not get his minister to listen to public service advice, gave the advice to one of the Big Four to put into a PowerPoint, sent it to the minister from one of the Big Four, and the minister then accepted, you know, took the advice seriously. Now, it's not a great story, right? But so, and that's one of the issues here, because we need a relationship of trust between executive government, if I can use that term, between ministers and public servants. And if the minister doesn't trust the public servants at all, and you get the ministers you get, right? It's not in our gift to say there are great ministers. Obviously, there are really terrific ministers, and there are not so good ministers. And you have to work with the one you get. But I thought that was an interesting story. Yeah.
Thank you. So the floor is now open for questions. Having given you thinking time for questions. No questions. I can't believe it. Can't believe it. Christabel.
Thank you, Peter. Christabel Darcy from the Department of Treasury and Finance. You mentioned before around it not being enough to hope that people are going to have enough moral fortitude, that we need to have systems and processes in place. Are there any jurisdictions across the world that you know are doing this well? You mentioned New Zealand. Are there any others, and are there any particular processes that seem to work well?
You're probably testing my knowledge base here. I would say that there are probably good examples in many jurisdictions that we could learn from, and the New Zealand one is one I'm familiar with because I was doing some research for a piece I've written about migration, and I was comparing Australia with other countries, and one of the countries was New Zealand, and I came across this cabinet document that explained exactly what the thinking was behind I couldn't believe it. It was laid out very clearly what the thinking was, and it was so illuminating in my little corner of migration policy that I was interested in. And I've had conversations with secretaries of department, or someone who's now a secretary of department, saying, well, you can't do that because then we'll hold back the advice we give because it might become public, we'll self-censor. I actually think that may happen initially, but people will get used to it. Journalists are not that hard-working that they're going to look at every cabinet submission, right? They're actually, it'll become normal. Data will be out there. I mean, there's all sorts of data sitting out on government websites that journalists don't know how to find. There's a lot more public than you realise, actually, when you start doing the detailed work. So I think it would become a new normal, and we would get used to the fact that there was a different kind of contest taking place. It's the same with freedom of information. I had that similar conversation. Well, if you empower freedom of information, then people will, it will be the sticky notes. We'll hold back what we say because we don't want, in our case in Victoria, the Herald Sun to be saying, government proposing, X, when in fact X is one extreme on a range of options put to government in a submission. There was a bunch of them. This would happen to be one of them, and it was probably the least favourable one and not endorsed and all the rest of it. So I can see why people are fearful of greater transparency, but I think that old adage about sunlight is actually quite a good one. We have to work with the media we've got as well. That's another challenge, of course.
He speaks as a journalist. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Hello. So there's a microphone just behind you.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Peter Washington, Department of Corporate and Digital Development. So the person who raised the concern about robo-debt wrote the letter. When she got knocked back, what could she have done more? I mean, could she have gone to the press? Could she have, alerted someone else? Was there something that she could have done that would have been more effective than what she did after she got knocked back?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure because she had actually done quite a lot. I guess she could have gone to the media, but and also I should say she wasn't the only. There was a whistleblower who's unnamed who used protective disclosure mechanisms to make similar points. So there was other, information was coming to the top. What she did was end up retiring earlier than she had to. She was disheartened by it. And she was kind of given reminders that she couldn't talk publicly. She was kind of warned off speaking publicly. It shouldn't be up to someone at her level to be carrying that burden, right? She did everything she was supposed to do. She raised it with her immediate supervisor. She went right to the top. She took incredible initiative, and nothing happened. So I'm not sure that we could have asked more of her. I don't know what others in the room think, what else she might have done.
Well,
Yep.
To clarify, no, I'm just, if we are in that situation, and we now have that historical context where someone goes all the way to the top, instead of retiring early, what would be the suggestions, I guess is what I'm asking in that situation.
Well, I'm interested in, if Vicky has some views here, but certainly documenting, at least for the record, so that it can be clear who ignored what or who failed to act on what. Keeping talking about it. Write another letter, you know. And that's what I mean. You'll start to become unpopular. You're not a team player. Let it rest. You know, we've moved beyond this, etc., etc. But actually, you have to. I think probably if it's a serious matter, you have to be the pebble in the shoe. But Vicky, I'd like you to answer that one.
Thanks, Peter. The other thing, of course, is here in the Northern Territory, we've got the Independent Commissioner Against Corruption. And part of what our duties are is we're all public sector officers. Part of our duties are that if we suspect corruption or maladministration and it's not being dealt with in an appropriate way or to your satisfaction, you have the opportunity to make a protected disclosure to the Independent Commissioner Against Corruption. And in fact, what's interesting, Peter, is that in the Commonwealth at the time that robo-debt was happening, there wasn't a similar kind of body in the Commonwealth. There is now in the Commonwealth, started I think on the 1st of July. There is now the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and I would have thought that something like that disclosure that was made, that letter, that person could now have gone to the NAC in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is when it's not corruption, right? When it's something less than corruption, but it's still deeply problematic. And that's, you know, like in the case with IPAA that I mentioned with the Health Services Union and the Health Education Fund, the Commissioner's finding was that it was not corruption in the sense of passing a legal threshold for prosecution. And the Premier came out and said, see, nothing to see here, we've been cleared. We've heard similar from other ministers about, indeed in relation to robo-debt, I was cleared, more or less. But that wasn't the case, right? There were very critical findings, but they didn't pass the threshold of actual corruption.
So we have improper conduct here.
Yeah, improper conduct, would be a... So I think that's probably, well, that's a great suggestion.
Other questions? Right, okay.
Well, can I just, I mean, I'm wary of saying too much here, but I want to say too that my experience here in the Territory, and I'm from down south, so, you know, take that. The program that Vicky talked about that we ran, I think one of the press-school ethical dilemma particular to the Northern Territory is the one you face. You know, the program we run was called Delivering in Partnership with Government and Community. And there's a kind of tension between these two things, delivering and the partnership bit. You want to deliver, you want to get results on the ground, your ministers want that, you want, you know, to get things done quick because there's such pressing need. And at the same time, the partnership part, as we know, requires deep consultation, engagement. It's a slow process. And I think that's, you know, it's an ethical dilemma because you do want to address these things. You've got two competing kind of agendas here. And so I just wanted to say again that having had some up close and personal time with 10 of your public sector leaders, how much I admire the work they are doing, the effort they are putting in, and the attempt, and I'm sure this goes to probably the rest of you in the room, to balance those two things, delivery on the one hand and true partnership on the other. It's a really big challenge, and you know, I commend you for the work you're doing in that space. Thanks.